Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Stephen White. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at COSI, and I'm also a proud member of the CMC Board of Trustees. We would also like to thank today's forum partners, the COSI Science Festival, Grange Insurance Audubon Center for their support, and thank you to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream, which is being carried on CMC's social media platforms. Let's give all of those supporting today's event another round of applause. Now, for our conversation today. The future of personal transportation isn't clear, but it won't be based on privately owned gas-powered cars forever. Future mobility will come in new forms: autonomous cars, high-speed rail, electric aircraft, and streets that prioritize pedestrians and bikes to make our cities green and walkable. We hope that today's discussion might just change the way that you think about getting from point A to point B. And so it's with that and great pleasure that I'd like to introduce today's speakers: Ted Angel, the Aerospace Affairs Director for the Dayton Development Coalition; Preeti Choudhary, who's the Executive Director of DriveOhio; Dr. Harvey Miller, Professor and Director of the Department of Geography Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University; and our host, the appropriately named Walker Evans, a co-founder and CEO of the Columbus Underground. You can read more about today's speakers in your forum flyers. Let's give them a round of applause for their joining us here today. And with that, Walker, I'm going to turn it over to you for our conversation.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Thank you, CMC, members and guests for being here today. This is my 8th or 9th time either being on a panel or a moderator, so I must be doing something at least adequate to be asked back. So thank you so much, to the CMC staff and team for having me here today. In 1989, a well-known documentary from Robert Zemeckis called Back to the Future Part 2 promised us that in the year 2015 we'd see flying cars, hoverboards, trash-fueled fusion engines, and of course fax machines in every room of the house. Similarly, in the 1982 film Blade Runner, set in the distant year of 2019, it featured futuristic flying cars along with a lot of other exciting technological advancements. Even James Bond was flying cars all the way back in 1974. And if 007 had the technology back then, 50 years later, we should have it by now too, right? Our cultural obsession with futuristic transportation is a tradition as commonplace in America as baseball and apple pie, but our reality doesn't always match our imaginations. According to the Wall Street Journal, only 10% of vehicles sold worldwide in 2022 were electric, due largely to increased adoption in Europe and China. Over 40 years, the number one vehicle sold in America is the Ford F-150 truck, which gets up to 20 miles per gallon in the city. SUVs have outsold sedans since 2015, while the average occupant per vehicle in America has declined to 1.5 people per car in a travel situation. So we love to dream of the future while continuing to burn the same fossil fuels that were used in the very first Model Ts that rolled off assembly lines 115 years ago. So I'd love to start this conversation with all three of you, just your general thoughts on why this disconnect exists, and is the answer capitalism? Ted, would you like to go first?
That's very interesting. First, thank you for having me as a speaker. I find it quite humorous that as I retired from the Air Force last year, I got into the advanced air mobility world, which is electric airplanes. Never thought of it while I was in the Air Force, never even comprehended it. And oh, by the way, this is the first year in my life at almost 50 that I own a car with powered windows. So I am excited though, and I know Preeti next to me very well, and I get amped up about the future of aviation. And I think to your point, we've heard about it. It's coming. And it's really about the folks in this room, in our society, in our culture, are we ready to accept it? And then when I say accept it, what does that look like? Because there's different forms of that transportation, whether it's ground vehicles, air vehicles, package delivery, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, that's how I approach this. This is how I see it, and I'm excited to talk about it. So,
Great. Preeti?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me as well. This is surreal. I've been an audience member many times here at CMC. This is the first time I'm on a panel, but I think that the disconnect, so let me start by saying I've been in the public sector for just about a year now. It's been very eye-opening, and related to the disconnect with maybe our envisioned future and what's actually happened, I think we need to see two things kind of converge, and we are starting to see some of that happen, and that is industry needs to be moving kind of in the same direction as policy. So it's not unrelated to capitalism, but without some sort of incentives from a policy perspective, I feel like we don't quite get to these envisioned futures. I mean, that may seem far off from thinking about flying cars, but really it's not. I mean, if we require more safety systems in place, if we require more of these, more of a shift or a pivot to alternative fuels, we'll see that becoming a reality. And I think in the case of electrification, we are seeing industry kind of making those promises, and then policymakers echo that with policies and funding in place to support that.
I think some of the disconnect we see here is actually our expectations towards technology and thinking that some magic technology is going to come along and fix our mobility problems. And we don't need that. There was a study by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics in the U.S. Department of Transportation, and it showed that in the United States, 50% of all trips across all modes of transportation were less than 3 miles, and almost 30% of those trips were less than a mile. Any trip 3 miles or less should not require a car, should not require a vehicle, should not require a jetpack. It could require yourself, walking, biking, and public transit. And that's what I guess I want to say, that's my message here today, is that the future of personal mobility should look a lot like the history of personal mobility. Walking, biking, and public transit. Walking for short trips, bicycles for medium trips, and especially e-bikes, which are really the true mobility revolution we should be supporting, and public transit for longer trips. Cars, whether electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, or even advanced air mobility, they can serve an important role in this mobility ecosystem we need to have moving forward, but cars should fill the gaps where walking, biking, and public transit doesn't work well. You know, places where it's not served well, people such as maybe parents with children, older adults, people with limited walking ranges, in situations you're making big purchases, you're have to move a lot of gear. That's when we need these vehicles. But for the most part, most of our trips in the city can rely upon what they have before the last century, when cars came along and just shifted our mobility systems towards one mode, which is driving. So we don't really need new technologies. We don't need innovations. We don't need jetpacks. We don't need magical thinking. We have what we need right now in order to solve our mobility problem. The technologies and the infrastructure and systems exist already. We just have to choose to rebalance our mobility systems so that walking, biking, and public transit are on equal par with driving.
Thanks for that. Ted, you mentioned that the technology is coming, and that's something that we hear a lot on a very frequent basis. There's actually a really great supercut video that floats around on the internet from time to time of Elon Musk promising that full autonomous driverless technology is coming next year. And that supercut video includes him saying that every year since 2014. So after 10 years of that sort of like overpromise and under-delivering, is 2024 going to be the year that we start to see some of this stuff roll out? Or when can we expect things to arrive?
Sure, I can speak to the aerial side of this. So I stay very connected to this industry, and I pay attention to a few things. One of those is there's an Advanced Air Mobility Reality Index that's put out by SMG Consulting once a month. And that index truly captures the reality of your question. Is this going to happen? And they use stoplight charts, red, green, yellow, to tell you where these companies are in their process. And right now, there are about 3 companies that they see in the green for 2024 that are going to provide passenger, so 4 passengers, 1 pilot, cargo type movement with your luggage. And then there's 1 cargo company that they believe is going to be in 2024 ready to enter service. It doesn't mean you're going to see hundreds and thousands of these vehicles, but you're going to start to see them deliver some of these vehicles to their customers. Some of those which are United, Amazon, UPS, American Airlines, Delta, who have invested in this process. And then in 2025, I think is the big reality of when you're going to see some of the bigger names in the aviation world, like the Joby Aviations, the Beta Technologies, the Archers, the Liliums, the bigger names in the industry, where you're going to see them come into service about 2025. Again, you're not going to see them in mass quantities. They're going to be little by little by little as the regulations and the infrastructure are stood up to support the operations.
Are these vehicles departing from airport to airport, or is this a different kind of system, like localized travel within a community?
So that's a good question. I can speak to the state of Ohio. We have about 88 regional airports, and these type of airplanes are kind of geared around using infrastructure that's already in place until we can build out the new infrastructure across the country. And so I think you'll see some of it being regional airports. I may take a small regional airport into Columbus or into Cincinnati or into Cleveland if I have business versus driving my car 3.5 hours from Dayton, as I would have to do to get to Cleveland to one of those meetings. Or you may see these eventually as the regulations stand up. You may see in rural areas where they've determined that population doesn't normally have the ability to use this type of transportation. They may put an elevated landing pad in that area that you could go to and use almost like an Uber. You get on an app, you buy your ticket, you go to that place, you get on your airplane, they take you to the next place where you've already booked your next flight through the same company to get on an American airline to take you to wherever you're going. That's a concept.
Interesting. Preeti, do you want to speak to the EV side of the original question?
Yeah, even just automation on the ground. One thing on the flight, I'll mention that there was an electric aircraft that did fly from the East Coast to Springfield. So that's one of the airports that it landed in. And there's a raised helipad essentially, but with EV charging on it that can house that. But are we going to see driverless vehicles on the ground in 2024? No, not necessarily. Not in Ohio. They exist. I think they're rolling out sort of in a similar way to the Aerospace. There are companies that have vehicles that are driverless. For the most part, they're only used in the southwest of the country, where weather is fairly predictable and favorable for autonomous systems. And I don't foresee them making their way to Ohio in the near future. Now, I am with DriveOhio, which is part of the Ohio Department of Transportation, and the whole reason we came to be was to really look at how technology could be applied to improve safety. And when we think about automation, we really think about the spectrum. Driverless operation is one end of the spectrum, but along the way are autonomous driving systems, things that we may be familiar with today, like lane keep assist and automatic emergency braking. And those things, when kind of stacked on top of one another, can have real meaningful impacts to and reductions to the number of fatalities that we see, the number of crashes that we see. So that's what I hope to see more of and increase of in the coming year, but likely not all the way driverless.
Harvey, do you agree with Preeti that they're not coming, or do you think Elon could make a very compelling tweet that they are coming next year?
No, I don't. No, I agree with Preeti. I think that it turns out that driving is a complex problem, and it's too complex for computers. There's been a real retrenchment in recent years in the automated vehicle industry. There is a strategy for making automated vehicles work, but it's not one that we would like. One way to make automated vehicles work in general applications to make our streets more predictable and more controllable. And that would mean making them less humane than they are presently, and they're already pretty inhumane. I've seen serious discussions where people are saying, well, if to make AVs work in cities, we would put fencing up along every street, disconnecting it from the sidewalk, and put automated gates at crosswalks so that people can't cross unless the walk sign is lit. That's not a city I want to live in. I don't want to live in a city of fences. I want to live in a city of connections. So I don't think it's coming. I really don't. I think I think driving assist is going to be very useful, as Preeti says, but in terms of a general application of automated driving, I think we're only going to see it in specific applications like college campuses, amusement parks, maybe even on dedicated bus lanes for public transit, but not in general, no.
Preeti, you mentioned the fatality question, which kind of ties into the next point I wanted to bring up. According to a recent report from Bloomberg, there have been 17 fatal crashes involving Tesla's automated driving assist program in less than the past 2 years. We've witnessed these dangers locally. Tomorrow is actually the 1-year anniversary of when a out-of-control Tesla slammed into the Columbus Convention Center going 70 miles an hour. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but if a large event were occurring, that could have been catastrophic. Are these types of crashes going to be the new normal with autonomous vehicles if they're adopted en masse? And will we have to accept that some level of increased death is necessary just to fulfill our desire to take our hands off the wheel?
No, I do not think we need to accept that. Very explicitly, no. The whole purpose for us we want to follow a crawl, walk, run model. I don't think we will see here a driverless operation again for a long, long time. And that's because, one, we currently don't have policy that would allow that. We do say that we need to test AVs, and we work with companies to test autonomous vehicles now, but all of that happens with a driver behind the wheel. And I think that's an important step in this whole process in ensuring safety that perhaps has been skipped a little bit with some of the systems that we've seen that have had those terrible incidents. In our case, what we're looking at specifically is how can these systems operate in real-world environments? And this is not driverless operation, but even those advanced driver assist functions, ensuring that they operate optimally so that people can rely on them, it is a key part of what we're trying to accomplish. So we're looking at demonstrations of this technology in rural areas as well as on interstates with a lot of heavy freight traffic, and actually testing some of these driver assist features on trucks themselves to ensure they're operating as they're intended to. And again, all of that happens with a driver behind the wheel that's paying attention and in place to help us hopefully get there and work with industry to make sure these systems are reliable in the future.
Harvey, yeah, I know you're big on reducing pedestrian deaths, the Vision Zero sort of initiatives, and a lot of what's going on right now is traditional vehicles causing crashes and injuries and fatalities. Are autonomous vehicles just counterintuitive for trying to solve those problems?
Well, the thing is that autonomous vehicles may lead to fewer crash rates and fewer fatality rates, but if autonomous vehicles lead to more driving, then that may overwhelm the marginal increase in safety, and we actually may see more deaths and more injuries. We all should know the name of Elaine Hertzberg. She was the first pedestrian killed by an autonomous vehicle on March 18, 2018 in Tempe, Arizona. She was killed by an Uber AV after the engineers made the detection software less sensitive because they were getting too many false positives. And that points to one of the problems with AVs is that if they were truly safe and as safe as people want them to be, which means 0 deaths, no one would want to ride in them. They'd be very slow and they would stop all the time. So there's just a real tension there between what we want out of our automobiles and what AVs can deliver in terms of safety. If we really want to save lives or really want to make people safe, we would encourage and support public transit, because public transit is the safest form of mobility in the United States. The data is very clear on that.
Ted, I want to circle back to the idea of flying cars, more for like the personal intercity trip realm. It sounds like something that's a bit further down the pipeline, further from reality, but companies like Tesla and Uber have been experimenting with different versions of that technology for the better part of the last decade. Billionaire Mark Lohr, a former Walmart exec, unveiled a vision for his $400 billion futuristic city Tolosa in 2021, and which he plans to build in a yet-to-be disclosed desert community out in the Southwest somewhere. But his vision for that includes these sort of like personal transportation pods that can be moved almost like drone, sort of like a drone with a human in it. Are we any closer to that becoming a reality, or is that just a billionaire's pipe dream turned press release?
That's a great question. I think I can build on what Preeti said. Full autonomy. I think the goal and the vision is to get to that concept, even with aviation, where, like I said, they call it Uber Elevate. So it's the Uber that is going to be the air taxi. And that's a great concept because eventually the goal is that you would get on your airline app, you would book your ride from your house, you would go to a location, get in an autonomous pod that would land. It's going to look like an airplane. You're going to sit in it with your luggage. It's going to take off. It's going to take you to your next destination where you can catch your flight to go to the West Coast because you're going to Disneyland or going to visit family or whatnot. I think it is a possibility. We are not going to see that in the near future. I think that is definitely, probably in the, I don't want to put a date on it, but it's going to be quite a few years down the road, 10 to 20 years or more before we are comfortable enough with our systems, our travel, UTM, our traffic management systems that would have to be able to manage these type of aircraft flying at lower altitudes where we're not used to seeing airplanes and things like that. But is it a possibility? Industry is moving to that. And so I think at some point in time, maybe my grandkids and maybe my kids will see that.
Preeti, Harvey, do you want to speak to that at all? Or even the safety concerns with that type of technology in cities?
I do worry about this because right now we have a safety problem with ground vehicles in Columbus. I mean, a car hits a building at a rate of almost once a week, it seems like, in Columbus, let alone the people who are hit by cars. And now we're going to have these in the air. And I also wonder about security. Maybe you could answer that question. Are we going to have some type of TSA level security for these air taxis? And if not, isn't it possible that a terrorist can take control of one of these things and all of a sudden, flying these things into my home where I work or my child's school? I think that's a concern that hasn't really been thought through yet in the industry.
Yeah, I would agree. There are a lot of unknowns, a lot of things to consider. The way that this becomes an integrated part of our mobility landscape. There are just so many elements to it, but those conversations are starting at a national level. NASA and the Federal Aviation Administration are starting to lead some of that discussion around community integration, and Ohio is one of the states at the table to help inform that. And even some of our MPOs, like MORPC, are all part of those conversations to just kind of start asking those questions on how we will tackle that in the future. But it'll be a long process, I imagine.
Let me jump back in. Sure. So I think Harvey brought up a great point of what the industry that is involved in this concept, what they're pushing to, and what we as a community and as members of the nation are willing to accept, I think is a great point. And I was just in a conference in London, and the very topic came up, and the stat that was brought up during the conversation was the biggest concern about the concept I just talked to is there's no flight attendant. And that is the number one concern of the folks who are being asked the question about autonomous flying.
While this does sound a little further down the road, as you mentioned, delivery drones, which we kind of talked about, are probably a little bit closer to reality. We are seeing some of the food delivery robots around OSU on the ground, and it's probably not too far-fetched to think that we could have them flying through the air to deliver our Amazon packages to our front door. Aside from the safety concerns, which I feel like we addressed, is there a quality of life issue that comes with just seeing these things in the sky? I mean, if anyone has like a kid with a little like phone-powered drone that you bought, they make noise, and so bigger ones make more noise. Are we going to just be listening to buzzing white noise outside in the future of Amazon package delivery?
I guess I can start. I would just say that this is already happening. Not in the U.S., right? There's some testing being done in the U.S., but overseas, this is already happening. In Singapore, they already have a daily offshore delivery that is all done through drone systems. In Europe, Zipline and Wing are operating in Africa and in Australia, and they're already displaying the ability to do package delivery. Now, maybe not on the large scale to where it's delivering to everybody's house in every community across, but this is already out there overseas, and there are testing, and the two companies, Zipline and Wing, the last time I read about them, they were talking about starting their operations, I think, in the next year here in the U.S. And so I think that this is a really good opportunity to learn from what's already been done, and then work with the FAA and the UTM systems in our Department of Transportation to find ways to be able to use this in the right scenario to where it is beneficial to maybe help with the road congestion that we see with all the logistics movements across our nation.
For the state, obviously, our transportation network spans different communities, different contexts, but we work with locals quite often to try to support local projects and priorities. And one of the things I certainly want to make sure we do is, I guess, related to the question, will we be hearing them flying above us all the time? It depends on the community, I would hope, really. And I would think that communities should have a say in whether or not they allow landing and takeoff kind of everywhere, if we want to centralize that, because it probably will become a reality for delivery in the nearer future, although there are some policy reasons why that might sort of prohibit that. The technology is there, but right now we don't allow that beyond, you can't fly a drone further than you can see it. So that would not allow you to just deliver anywhere. But in the future, when we may facilitate that, where we want to direct that traffic is really up to us, I think. And that's why it's really important that we're at the table with those federal partners who are thinking about this from a really high level, no pun intended, from a really high level view. They're looking at this and they're not thinking about the community members necessarily, but they have invited us to participate so we can make that connection.
So I live in the neighborhood of Harrison West, which is between downtown and Ohio State. And during the Ohio State Fair, there was a helicopter tour going over our house every 10 minutes for the entire length of the fair. It's like apocalypse now. It's like I want to hunker down in my basement, It is terrible, it really is. And, we're going to be adding more noise to our skies. I don't think that's a great idea. I mean, our cities are noisy enough already, and the reason why they're noisy is because of all the vehicles, and we're just talking about expanding that even more. I think that's a real serious implication for our quality of life.
I mean, and that's a great point too, because what are drones but small helicopters, right? That's literally what they are. Just to kind of back up a little bit, there's some concerns with history repeating itself. When automobiles were first adopted en masse in America in the 20th century, it paved the way for suburban sprawl, white flight, abandonment of downtowns, and mandatory car commutes, to work, to school, to everywhere you want to go. I've read some interesting think pieces from environmentalists who are cautioning that autonomous vehicles and autonomous deliveries will sort of enable a second wave of suburban sprawl 2.0, where anyone with the means to purchase one of those vehicles can just live further and further out and sleep on their commute because they don't need to drive. Is this something that we should be concerned about? Just going kind of backwards on sprawl?
We should be concerned about this. There's a tight connection between transportation and land use. Transportation affects land use, and land use affects transportation. And if you look at a history of a city like Columbus, you could see it was developed in different transportation eras. Like Victorian Village, German Village, places like that. That was the walking era where we were limited by how far people could walk. Places like Clintonville and Grandview Heights were developed during the streetcar era, and then the whole rest of it was developed after World War II because of the automobile when we built highways. So lowering the friction of distance means that Columbus may sprawl even more, which makes it more challenging for other forms of mobility, such as walking, biking, and public transit. But not only is this a problem for transportation, it's a problem for the fiscal viability of our cities. So everyone remembers the formula for the area of a circle, pi r square. That says as the radius of a circle gets larger, the area expands geometrically much quicker. Cities are like that. As we continue to sprawl outward, as the radius of the city grows outward, the area over which we have to provide urban infrastructure and urban services increases geometrically. And we can't afford any more sprawl. We can't even afford the sprawl we have now. So this is really a danger with this new technology.
My personal opinion is that autonomy won't necessarily increase sprawl because it doesn't change how much time necessarily it will take for you to travel those long distances. And I personally don't want to invest any more time than I need to in traveling to and from work. Maybe that's a thing with my generation where we want to be closer and closer to where we need to live our lives, but I would hope that it wouldn't have, certainly wouldn't be the same impact as building a freeway system and sort of the initial sprawl decades ago.
Yeah, I think from my personal perspective, I agree. I see this enhancing our lives and giving us opportunities that maybe we don't have, or I think of my parents who never leave their house, right, because they're just at an age where they don't want to. But if they have to go to the doctor, it takes them 40 minutes to get there, right? This is an opportunity to where maybe my parents in their older life would go to more doctor's appointments when they need to and choose not to, because now they have a tool that allows them to spend the right amount of time doing something that should be important.
We'll move to questions from our live stream and in-person audiences in just a few minutes. So if you have a question, please make your way to the microphone now. If you're watching online, please type your questions into the chat. But before we take audience questions, I have one final question for our panelists. So I know a lot of my questions today have been drenched in skepticism. I do honestly love technology. I love city planning. I love these kinds of conversations. But I do think there's a lot of value in all of us questioning what is real and what is marketing hype. Because as fun as it is to watch a flying DeLorean, it's just movie magic. It doesn't exist. So I'd like to ask each of you, just on a positive, optimistic note, I'd like to ask each of you, what's one thing in Columbus and Dayton and Central Ohio that we've been doing really well on the transportation front, whether large or small, just something that is really exciting to you? Harvey, you want to start?
Looking at
Sure.
Me, okay. People like to throw shade on COTA, but I actually think COTA does a pretty good job. They're facing really tremendous headwinds because they're in a sprawled, auto-dominated city, and they also are in a state that is abysmal when it comes to funding public transit. So they face a real uphill battle. On the other hand, they've done some really good things like the C-Pass program, the pass for downtown workers. That's been tremendously successful. The C-Max bus route along Cleveland Avenue, I've looked at the ridership data. That is tremendously successful as well. One thing I really like what COTA is doing right now, and the City of Columbus and MORPC, is the Link Us initiative. I think that that's a really good idea. This is a bus rapid transit initiative, and also some, putting surrounding mobility infrastructure and zoning in order to increase densification along several corridors. I think that's a really good idea. I think that's a very good solution for Columbus, and I'm a big supporter of that. So pay attention to that. It'll be on the ballot in November 2024, and I'll be voting yes. I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that was a good plug. Agree with the Link Us plug for the ballot initiative next year. I think what Ohio is doing well is trying to not put all their eggs in one basket. We're trying to investigate different tools. The mobility provides a lot of opportunity and challenges, and we're using multiple tools in the toolkit, including technology, to try to help alleviate and address some of our challenges. And I think certainly in the time that I've been here in Columbus, they're trying to do so more equitably. So we're thinking about urban cores, we're thinking about Central Ohio, in as much as we're thinking about rural areas and Appalachian counties as well. So that's what I've seen has been really positive.
I agree.
Ted?
Yeah, I would agree that I think what I like in my short time in my position at the DDC is I've watched the state of Ohio be involved in this change. So from the top down, across the board, we are involved with the national campaign in NASA that is helping stand up advanced air mobility with the FAA. We're tied in close with our FAA partners to help ensure that we're providing data that affects the regulations and the policies that are being written. And we have the support across the whole state. And then we're also working on the things that Preeti just mentioned, creating flying corridors between Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati, the 33rd Smart Corridor right here locally and outside of the area. We're doing things to be a part of ensuring that we are able to ask those hard questions and make sure that our communities have a voice in how this is moving forward.
Great, thanks so much. It's CMC's longstanding tradition to take audience questions. Lainey Cuthbert with CMC is curating questions from today's live stream audience. For those of you with us in person today, please join Lainey at the microphone. Out of respect for others, please keep your questions brief and to the point so we can get through as many as possible in the next 16 minutes. We don't have a hook or a gong, but if your question turns into a speech, we might look for one. So please keep that in mind and do end with a question mark. Can we have our first question?
Yes, thank you, Walker. Rick Shiro asks, I am curious about the debate points each panelist would make if debating the opposite side. For example, Harvey is contrarian to autonomous vehicles. What would his argument be for them?
But what besides that?
You're a contrarian when it comes to autonomous vehicles. What would be your argument in favor of them? Like, what would be your argument from the other side?
Okay, if I was forced to take that. Well, humans are terrible at driving. Let's face it. We all are terrible at driving. We really are. Everyone thinks there was just something in the dispatch a few weeks ago saying that 94% of drivers surveyed, think that they're great drivers and everyone else sucks. We all suck. Our brains did not evolve to operate heavy machinery at high speeds, protected only with lights and paint from each other. So that is a big advantage of autonomous vehicles. They're not perfect, but they're better than humans.
So would I have to take the Harvey stance?
Arguing, I guess, for regressive
for
transportation.
Gas or
yeah.
regressive, that's
Yeah,
hard,
yeah.
Walker.
What if we all went back to gas-guzzling cars of the 1970s?
Oh, God.
What's your argument for that?
They look cooler. That's all I got.
Big old Cadillacs.
Yeah.
I guess with that, Ted, why should we not have these plane systems?
Obviously, I'm pretty motivated about going in this direction, but I think for me, I look at it as from a safety standpoint. I'm all about it, but I don't want to risk safety to just make this happen. And so I see that as that's.
Yeah, that's fair. What's our next question?
My name is Cornell Robertson, honored to serve as the elected Franklin County engineer. At the Franklin County Engineer's Office, we maintain and build roads, bridges, and infrastructure for multiple modes of transportation. We have two main sources of revenue: gas tax. We get about $4 million per year. From motor vehicle registration fees, we get about $32 million a year. So I have two questions related. Number one, in the future, do you all think that there will be a need for government agencies to maintain and build transportation infrastructure? And if so, what do you think the revenue source would be to maintain that transportation infrastructure? Thank you.
Hey, Cornell. Yes, I think that government will continue to maintain transportation infrastructure. We are all very acutely aware, I think, certainly in government, that the amount of revenue we get now does not match what we need. Inflation continues to rise, and revenue that we get from the gas tax is on the decline. So one of the things that the Ohio Department of Transportation is doing is a study and a public awareness campaign looking at potential alternative revenue sources. And I envision in the future they will implement some sort of strategy or propose a strategy all in concert with the public. You know, what I've seen in a former life when I was in the private sector was that a lot of states test mileage-based user fees, for instance, where you basically get charged for how much you drive or travel, the way that you travel, et cetera. A lot of states roll that out without letting the public know it's coming. And that's been met with a lot of resistance. So I commend Ohio for making the choice to start with public awareness, with a teaching strategy on just letting folks know how we actually are funded, because I think there's a lot of misconception. I've heard it at the State House where everyone thinks ODOT has deep pockets, and it's just not true. So that's one aspect of it. And then the strategy that's going to be developed will likely have multiple sources. So you mentioned, I mean, basically the two sources right now are registration and gas tax. I think in the future it's going to include a lot more elements. And there are examples here and there of other states that do things like adding a surcharge to Amazon deliveries and other sorts of unique ways to kind of capture a little bit of additional revenue to support our continued operation and maintenance.
Okay, I just want to add a little extra context on this because this was actually tied very closely to a question that we didn't quite get to, because I think there's some information that maybe not everyone in the room is fully aware of. The federal gasoline tax in America is 18.4 cents per gallon. That rate was set in 1993, 30 years ago. Inflation has increased 99.6% since then. So we decided 30 years ago to stop funding highways, bridges, roads. The Highway Trust Fund that money goes into, the Federal Highway Trust Fund, ran out of money in 2008. So it's been insolvent since then. We've been bailing it out every year ever since then. So if you wonder why our roads are crumbling, it's because 30 years ago we decided to stop funding them to the level that we need to. Yeah.
I don't have much to add to that. That's a really good insight and good context, Walker. I will say that when we talk, well, first of all forms of transportation require public subsidies. There's no form of transportation that'll work without major investment from public funding. Driving is the most expensive form of mobility to subsidize. If we want to make better use of our public money, we should shift away to more cost-effective forms of mobility. But it doesn't mean we're going to walk away from all this infrastructure we've built over the last century. That'd be ridiculous. It already is in place, and we're not going to roll it back quickly. That's why I'm in favor of things like the Link Us initiative, bus rapid transit. That's a much more efficient use of our public infrastructure for transportation than driving.
Ted, you want anything?
I would just say that I think the infrastructure still needs to be in place because Preeti mentioned earlier that you can't fly autonomous beyond visual line of sight. So a lot of the initial things I'm seeing they are using the roadways as their, and the bridges and all of those things as their paths initially, because those are ways that we can install smart things and sensors and those type of things so that we can continue to use beyond visual line of sight. So hopefully, or maybe that would create some form of revenue to use those corridors, so to speak.
What's our next question?
Okay, online we have two people asking similar questions, so I'll try to merge them here. Tanya Bills asks, can we focus on the 3-mile trips that millions take every day that Dr. Miller mentioned earlier, and how we have the technology today to make these safer, faster, and more equitable? In the same vein, Isaac Bean asks, what do you see as the easiest path towards a less car-dependent city here in Columbus? Leaning into CODA, bike lanes, street design, where should we start?
All of that. Truly. Again, most of our trips are short, and the main reason why people can't use, other forms of mobility for making those short trips is because the infrastructure and built environment is against them. We literally prevent people from using more sustainable forms of mobility. So a big part of it is safety. According to surveys, the vast majority of the population, 50%, is interested but concerned about biking. In other words, they're willing to bike, but they won't do it if they're exposed to traffic. So protected bike infrastructure. We need to redesign our streets. Our streets are unsafe because they're designed for speed over safety. We need to slow traffic down, and we need to make our streets safer, and that would make it better for everyone, and we would be able to see other forms of mobility flourish if we just gave them a level playing field. But right now, all the cards are stacked against walking, biking, and public transit in favor of cars.
I agree. Rebalancing is necessary, as Harvey mentioned, and I think in the city of Columbus, you can see some of that actively happening where they're trying to make some strides, rebalancing. It might be controversial, sort of sacrificing parking for bike lanes, for instance, but it'll help facilitate some of a shift in modality.
Yeah, I think Harvey captured it perfectly. As an avid road biker, I now call myself a bike path biker because I just don't trust a lot of my fellow Americans that ride next to me on the road and scream at me while I'm riding on the bike. So I try to find ways to travel on my bicycle that involve being on a bike trail where other people like me are used to being in that environment.
Next question.
I'm Scott Whitlock, a member of the club. I'd like to address the green portion of our topic today. Question: Toyota recently got approval from the California Air Resources Board for a drop-in hydrogen fuel cell drivetrain that can be used in any Class 8 tractor. They're being used to haul containers out of the Port of Los Angeles. My question is, given the weight of batteries, is long-haul trucking dead, or is it going to convert to hydrogen fuel cell in the very near future? Second, if your answer is yes, are all the interstate truck stops going to have hydrogen refueling facilities? And third, if your answer to that is yes, when people then see the availability of hydrogen fuel, will much of our surface transportation convert not to battery electric, but to hydrogen fuel cell drivetrains?
Question. So I think you're right in that heavy vehicles, the batteries required for heavy vehicles are too heavy. Now, that doesn't mean folks are not looking into medium and heavy duty electrification, but I will say that right now where we are is we're at a stage of studying all of the options: hydrogen fuel cell, electrification, natural gas. All of the options are being looked at. Our counterparts in Indiana are actually looking. They want a grant to look at I-80 and identify which alternative fuel makes the most sense for heavy-duty vehicles, where those refueling stations could be. On a personal note, I do think hydrogen fuel cell will sort of emerge as a potential winner for heavy vehicles. Will truck stops then provide hydrogen as a fuel? I would suspect yes. I know that for the EV charging stations, we are going to see gas stations and truck stops add electric vehicle charging equipment, in their areas. We've had conversations with a lot of private sector in that space, and they're aware that as folks make the shift, I mean, really, where they all make their money is the convenience stores and, bringing people inside to buy things, and so they want to continue doing that. They'll provide, I think, whichever options are being used, and if we see the industry shifting, and again, this was kind of echoed in the EV space, but if the industry shifts and then the private, the federal government actually is providing grant money for alternative fuels, including hydrogen. So if that happens, then we'll see an uptick of that. And I forgot your third question, I'm sorry.
Well, so should hydrogen fuel cell then be recognized in subsidies as where we are very likely going given the current technologies, or even what we can expect over the next 10 years to achieve zero emissions?
That's a really good point, and something we can start having conversations about after we've done these kind of feasibility studies on the matter, but I would expect that would be a conversation we have.
I'll add that there has to be some real technological breakthroughs for hydrogen fuel to work, because the energy density of hydrogen is very low. And that's the big problem, is trying to make it dense enough so it can be portable and being carried in vehicles. It could happen, but it's going to require a major technological revolution for that to occur. And also, hydrogen infrastructure itself, fueling infrastructure, is going to be very expensive. That's why I think we'll see it in fleet vehicles like buses and universities and things like that before we'll see it in personal vehicles.
Anything else to add? Yeah. Thank you for the very specific question. What's our next one, Laney?
Okay, we have another couple from online. Nancy Nanny asks to encourage more people, this is people changing their attitude towards transportation, to walking, for example. How would people feel safe walking at night? And additionally, again, a change in how you're doing your transportation. How do the people in Columbus who don't own a car expect to get their groceries? Bike paths don't get you to the grocery, or don't get you out to the grocery store. You can't get your groceries on a bike is essentially what he's saying.
We used to get their groceries without cars for, thousands of years actually before the car came along. And now because the car came along, all our grocery stores are becoming bigger and farther apart and require cars to get to them. So we need to roll that back, basically. The first part of your question, of the question was about walking at night. I think that's a fear of crime, I would guess, from that question. The great urbanist Jane Jacobs pointed out that, crime fills vacuums. If there's people on the street, if people are walking, you're not going to have that type of activity. If a lot of eyeballs on the street, people think the neighborhood belongs to them, they're out there walking around, then we won't see that problem. But really, it's these things happen when no one's on the street, and that's what makes it hard for people to walk.
I think we have time for just one more question, real quick.
Yes, as an extension of safety devices that they're putting on cars now, where you have lane change sensors, you have distance sensors of the car in front of you. We're now building in a Bluetooth network where we will be able to cover the entire county. I know it's going to be covering Westerville, but by the end of the year. So we're driving down the street by using that Bluetooth network as an extension of our safety sensors. We will be able to tell if a car that's blindsided to us behind a building or something is going to run the light and maybe have a potential collision. So that will make the streets much safer, kind of like the air traffic controllers have in the sky. Oh, one last, if Apple built a car, would it have windows?
So the question is...
Yeah, go ahead.
So the question is, should we have those kinds of technologies? Should we rely upon those kinds of technologies?
That's okay for vehicles, or what about people? Are we going to have to load up in technology just to walk out our front door? And in fact, most of the fatalities and serious injuries from vehicles now are happening to pedestrians and cyclists. That's where we're seeing the growth in fatalities. So, we can't expect people to wire up and put on special clothing and sensors and things like that just to go out their front door to buy a gallon of milk.
I would
How about
argue.
attacking a deer so you don't hit a deer?
Tag the deers with
Yeah.
technology? Sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
You start.
No, I would argue that we are equipped with sensors at all times. And actually, it is something that we're looking at. I think you were essentially referring to connected vehicle technology, which allows vehicles to talk to other vehicles and to talk to infrastructure and to talk to people via cell phone apps. Now, how those apps actually function, what it does in my pocket, if it buzzes or yells at me and says a car is coming, I think that's what's being developed right now, but it is something that we're looking at, and we are very hyper aware that a lot of those fatalities are happening to our, what we call vulnerable road users, so people that are not protected by metal cages, people walking and biking, and we want to make sure that those types of applications can benefit them. So there are talks with private sector on try to pilot and test some applications that might help.
Thanks so much for all of the questions. We could probably spend 6 more hours talking about these interesting topics, but I want to turn it back over to Stephen to wrap us up.
Well, first off, thank you, all of you, for that amazing conversation. I hope you all found the conversation as I did around the future of mobility very fascinating. And I think whether it's flying cars, pods, drones, driverless cars, I think that there are, while exciting, that there are a lot of questions that remain. And that these technologies have the potential to impact critical areas of safety, innovation, our environment, and planning, both for our community as well as for our families. And while the future may not be clear, what is clear is that all these technologies involve all of us. And though it may take some time, each and every one of us will play a role. And so as we leave here today, I encourage all of us to recognize that this technology is all around us. Science is all around us. In fact, science is everywhere and for everyone. And I think it's fitting that this conversation helped kick off the Science Festival for our community today. And I hope that each of you will continue that dialogue as we move forward. So thank you to today's partners, the COSI Science Festival, the Grange Insurance Audubon Center, and thank you to our virtual seat patrons and to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. And a very special appreciation for our guest speakers today here, Ted Angel, Preeti, Choudhary, Harvey Miller, and our hosts, Walker Evans. Let's give them another round of applause, shall we? So please make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum, which will be Beating the Stigma of Substance Addiction and Mental Illness, right here at Grange Insurance Audubon Center. Please take a moment to answer the short survey that's in your forum flyers. And we could not do this without each and every one of you every single week. So a tremendous thank you on behalf of CMC. And I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Thank you.